Thank you everyone for joining us here in London in the room. And thank you to our online participants who are joining us from all corners of the globe. I'm Hannah Bretherton and I'm the Lao China Institute's Impact and Engagement Manager. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening panel session of our inaugural China Week. The Lao China Institute is a global centre for the research, study and understanding of contemporary China. China Week is our new flagship week-long series of activities designed to foster greater understanding of China's growing global influence and what it means for us here in the UK. The theme of our first China Week is climate change and the environment. It's a timely topic given that the UK will play host to the UN COP26 climate change conference starting next week. By bringing together researchers from across King's and other institutions, along with industry leaders from business community and government, we are providing a forum for discussion and knowledge exchange on China's role in addressing one of the greatest challenges of our time. The next few days are an opportunity to hear diverse perspectives on a range of topics within this theme and to contribute your voice on these issues. China Week is designed to engage with a broad audience, not only within academia, as we believe that China's profound development impacts us all, and it's vital that we build a deeper understanding and appreciation of these impacts. Today's session, China's 2060 Carbon Pledge, looks at the economic and environmental challenges facing China in its transition to a low carbon future. It will be no mean feat to achieve this, as China continues to strive for economic growth, but it's a challenge that China, along with international partners, must rise to. A quick bit of housekeeping. So this is a hybrid event with speakers joining us both in person and on the screen. We also have an audience in person and joining us online. So if you are online, please make sure to enter your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. And for those of you in the audience, we'll be passing around the microphone so that you can also ask your questions and make this an interactive and engaging discussion. You are welcome to tweet throughout the event using the hashtag China Week. I'm now very pleased to introduce our panel chair and moderator, Cindy Yu. Cindy is the China reporter and broadcast editor at The Spectator and host of the very popular podcast, Chinese Whispers. Cindy will introduce our speakers and kick off the session. Thank you so much and welcome, Cindy and panelists.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So here in the UK, we are getting ready for COP26, and that's less than a week away. And in the last week, the British government has given a flurry of green announcements on everything from gas boilers to an estimated rough cost of net zero. And that's caused some consternation around the country and around Westminster, certainly with the Conservative Party, you know, back in the backbenches, a little bit up in arms about the cost of the whole thing and what it's going to take to get to 2050. But 10 years after 2050 is when China wants to reach carbon neutrality. So how is China, the biggest emitter of carbon of greenhouse gases in the world and the biggest consumer and producer of coal, going to reach carbon neutrality 10 years after Britain reaches net zero? And that's the question we're going to be asking our esteemed panelists today, and asking about how much of China's strategy and goal is hot air and how much is actually realistic. So I'm joined by a panel of expert guests to discuss, and we'll take your questions as well in not too long, so think of some good ones. Joining me on the stage are Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, a non-profit publication dedicated to building an understanding of environmental issues in China. James Pennington, whose work at the World Economic Forum focuses on the circular economy in China. Joining us on screen is Chunping Xie, an energy economist at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at the LSE, who is leading a program to inform decision-making about China's policies on climate change. And from Beijing is Chen Ji, a principal consultant at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who is working directly with policymakers and investors in China on the energy transition to a low carbon future. So welcome, everyone. So let's start with the first question. Isabel, what are the primary environmental objectives of the 14th five-year plans? I.e., where are we at with Chinese legislation and goal right now? Because we've heard, this ramping up of rhetoric in China about climate change, haven't we?
We have, and there was a great deal of anticipation for the 14th five-year plan because it was the first major, planning event after the 2060 announcement in 2020 when Xi Jinping stood up and, digitally stood up, actually digitally sat down, what am I saying, and announced at the UN General Assembly that China would go for carbon neutrality by 2060. So, of course, everyone thought, okay, 14th five-year plan, that's going to be setting out the pathway. In fact, that in a 150 plus page document, that target only got mentioned once. And energy security got mentioned an awful lot more. So that everybody kind of looked at this and thought, well, hang on a minute, where's the action here? And that still is a bit of a question because it didn't rule out coal. It didn't set an absolute carbon cap. There were a lot of things that people sort of expected to come into place, which didn't come into place in the 14th five-year plan. And there's a whole set of questions about why that was, and I think the geostrategic tensions had something to do with it. The salience of energy security in China, as we've seen in recent weeks. So what did it do? The other thing it didn't do, which was slightly more positive, was it didn't, for the first time, set a GDP target. Now, why that mattered was, China used to, most countries say our GDP growth this year was such and such, and China used to say our GDP growth next year will be such and such. And what that meant was that all across the country, officials had to meet that GDP target. And that became, their primary measure of achievement and progress and promotion and all those things. So environment was always quietly being sacrificed to the primary goal of GDP growth. So without GDP growth, it meant that, it was a signal that the emphasis was changing in China's economic and indeed climate planning. The problem was that without GDP growth, given that China hadn't set any absolute targets, they were all relative to economic performance. There was then a bit of a head scratcher about, well, how do we measure progress? Because there isn't an absolute cap, and there isn't a GDP target against which you can measure things like carbon density. So China's climate-related targets up till now have been to do with economic output. So how much carbon do you have to emit to produce $1 or 50 yuan of GDP? And that intensity, that density target has been improving. It started off with a very, very inefficient economy in terms of emissions, and it's been getting steadily better. And that's good. That's a climate-friendly direction of travel, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're reducing your emissions, because you can still be growing your economy more efficiently and growing your emissions. So you're growing them less than you would have done if you hadn't become more emission. So all of China's targets are it's a bit like being on a seesaw, where you're kind of constantly rebalancing and trying to understand what's happening. However, since the 14th plan, we've seen this process that you get with Chinese five-year planning, which, the kind of headline gets announced, and then working groups are set up to try and deliver it. And we're seeing, for example, sectoral working groups on coal and steel and all of that. So what we have right now is the 2030 target, the 2060 target, and we have a coal cap at around 2025, which is positive. And then we have density targets, which are regarded as pretty insufficient if we're actually going to get to 2060. So there's a sense that China is moving. It's not retreating, but it's not moving fast enough right now in its up to 2030 plan or its up to 2025 plan, actually to guarantee arriving safely at 2060 carbon
neutrality. So it's still quite
neutrality.
an ambitious target, 2030 and 2060, given the pace of moving right now.
Ambitious target of 2030, no. 2030 is a very loose target. It was what China promised in Paris in 2015. It was regarded as a loose target then. So that's the 2030 target is the peaking, the date at which China promises to peak its emissions. That matters because when you peak and the level at which you peak obviously affect your chances of getting to the 2060 target. And I think the world is coming rightly to the conclusion that what we do between now and 2030 is probably the most important period in everybody's planning, and are looking to China for, you know, a bit more welly in this, frankly, you know, a bit more more speed, more effort right now, so that the cliff is slightly less steep after 2030. You know, just to repeat the 2030 target 5 years later, with a slightly elastic promise or earlier, you know, and everybody thought, well, the or earlier is clearly going to be what they offer for Glasgow. But now we have a crisis and coal is back, and, you know, so a bit earlier is probably the best we can hope for right now.
Right. Jinping, let me come to you next. So there's a lot to do before 2030 or 2060, indeed. What are the realistic areas or what are the important areas within China, the sectors that need to do change and do the heavy lifting, as it were?
Right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And so I think the transitioning to a carbon neutral economy, it means that a profound transformation in system design and operation must take place across the whole economy, not just focus on the energy sector, and in particular across 4 big economic systems: energy, transport, city, and land. And first of all, controlling energy activity, especially the consumption of fossil fuels, it will be the key to achieving carbon neutrality, and central to any pathway to achieve this goal must be that China begins to generate most of its electricity from non-fossil fuel sources, and then quickly expand use of this clean power whenever possible. This means huge investment gap in renewable energy generation, in energy storage facilities, in green zero carbon buildings and other fields. But these also present great opportunity for job creation and can facilitate economic upgrading. And the most crucial strategy for China's energy transition is to stop building new coal-fired power plants and to support the affected coal communities to ensure a just transition. And during the energy transition, like Isabella just said, that the energy security issue is in the spotlight. It's crucial for China to drive forward the power sector reform to build market-based electricity transaction mechanisms and to enable better management of the grid to support large-scale penetration of renewables. And transport is also a key sector, as it accounts for more than 24% of carbon emissions globally. Reform on China's transport system has been focusing on electrification of road transport. China has the world's largest EV market and is at the forefront of development of EV battery technologies. And as its EV industry advances due to strong policy support, economics of scale, and increased competition, has quickly driven down the cost and stimulated technical innovations. The difficulty is the emission reduction of air transport and ocean-going vessel transport. And about as cities generate more than 80% of global GDP and account for more than 75% of global carbon emission. However, urban environment issue is more of a problem of development model. The old driver of urbanization are losing momentum in China as the industrialization model of polluting, energy intensive and high carbon growth can no longer meet the requirement for building a sustainable and resilient economy. And thus, a new type of urbanization is needed, with a focus on improving people's well-being rather than being GDP-oriented. And land use is very destructive across the world. Food and land use systems are emitting carbon greenhouse gases, destroying forests and other natural ecosystems. And in China, the nature-based solutions will have a crucial role to play, but that is not enough. The relationship between man and land must be rebuilt through a fundamental change of development paradigm with sustainability at the heart. That will include transformation of modern agriculture on what to produce and how to produce it, and even include changes of lifestyle and our diet. In a world, the functioning of land, sustainable transport, energy supply, and urban infrastructure overall constitute a complex system. And we need to pull through investment, spur innovation, enable structural change, and encourage behavioral change in the right direction to facilitate the changes needed across the whole economy, and in particular across the four big systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jinping. James, let me come to you next. So in my introduction, I mentioned the nervousness in this country about 2050 that we saw, what we have been seeing for a while, and also in the last week of announcements. What does Chinese public opinion think about all of this that's going on? Do your average Chinese man on your lobby scene, do they care about 2060 or 2030?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's actually one of the tragedies of the last couple of years for those of us who are not based in China but work on China, is the difficulty in kind of gauging how that's going, right? I mean, I think everyone here, I haven't been able to visit China for the last 2 years now. Most of my interactions have been on Zoom. We do a lot of work with the China Council for International Collaboration on Environment and Development, and with the Ministry of Environment. You know, we've been able to effectively transition, but getting some of those insights on the ground has been more difficult. And I think that also this is a challenge, I think, for the whole world, for this, the fact that things are a little bit more cut off and some of those people-to-people relationships are a little bit less. So I couldn't say for the last couple of years exactly how that's kind of gone down. I think though, when you look at some of the sort of broader points here as well, and I think just to echo some of the points from Jinping, when we look at this and some of the work we've been doing in China, when we look at the road to 2060, obviously there's the sort of the energy piece, which is a little bit clearer on what the road is and where China needs to go. And China's really leading on sort of solar and on wind. There's huge challenges still, but at least the road is a little bit clearer. Transport as well, China's really leading on EVs and also on urban mobility, and there's a sort of a clear path there as well. But I think that one of the really key things is the more harder to abate sectors and what's going to happen there. I mean, if you look at the general structure of China's economy, if you look sort of globally at emissions, around 27% of emissions come from industry, sort of or sort of general industry. You look at China, and that gets much closer to sort of 40%. It's still a very industrial economy, and within that you have some sectors which are very difficult to decarbonize. So cement, steel, sort of chemicals, aluminium, some of these different areas which are around the globe, and also as mentioned, sort of aviation, shipping, some of these areas. And there's numerous technologies that need to be put in place. There's huge investments that need to happen to be able to decarbonize those particular industries. So I think have
these technologies even been invented? They have. Okay.
In most cases, yeah, exactly. In most cases, yeah, but a lot of the time they're not at a sort of economical space in terms of the prices sort of need to come down for it to happen. And I think China's really well placed to bring those prices down. I mean, you also look at some of those different industries. So if you look at, for instance, the steel industry in China, where I believe it's around 50%, or at least the target is around 50% of steel output in China comes from the five biggest companies. So Baowu Steel, which is the biggest Chinese steel company, produces more steel than India does as a country. It's just it's quite a consolidated industry. So there is space there for some of those big companies to start implementing some of the technologies which are needed to bring the emissions down. And I think there could be a sort of a plausible way forward there from some of that consolidation. Cement again has some consolidation. I think around 20 companies accounts for about 40 to 50% of cement production. But again, China produces around 60% of the world's cement. So this is again a huge area where there needs to be a lot of technology put in place. But then you look at something like chemicals, and that's a much more distributed sector. There are some big players, but then also there's a lot of smaller players as well. So decarbonizing the chemical sector is going to be difficult. And one of the things within that, which we've been working on a lot, is the circular economy side. This will also be vitally important. And talking about more people on the street, you can see recently when you look at a more household level, there's been a number of circular pilot cities that put in place. The work that was done in Shanghai had quite a lot of publicity, where going from a sort of mixed trash to trash separation, sort of food waste, plastics, and you see the recycling rates growing at a domestic level. But also, if you look at the construction industry and the built environment, where a lot of this cement and steel is being used, there's a huge way to go there in terms of circular economy interventions, which will help get to net zero. So around now, China only recycles around 5% of construction waste, which is pretty low, and it accounts for about 30 to 40% of all waste in Chinese cities. So there's a huge way to go there in terms of reusing cement, reusing some steel, aluminium, and some of these areas. And also if you look at that kind of urban infrastructure and the construction, most of the infrastructure that people will be living in 2060 in China isn't built yet. And there'll be a lot of demolition on the way to get there, because a lot of what's been built in the last 30 years wasn't necessarily built to last. So I think decarbonizing the construction sector and those hard to abate materials is going to be really important, and circular economy is going to be important within that. And also having the right construction codes in place. So also how those buildings are built. There's been some interesting pilots and some interesting policies around near zero emission buildings being built. So for instance, Hebei had a pretty good scheme in terms of mandating that 10% of the buildings would be near zero emissions. I think that kind of thing needs to continue. There's also opportunities around integrating solar into some of the newer buildings as well, and really sort of thinking about that built environment space. So yeah, I think for me that whole area of materials and then the importance of the circular economy, and then also the built environment are some of the key areas that we're looking at the World Economic Forum. And I think will be really important going forward to 2060.
Brilliant. And Chen-Ji, I want to come to you next, but before I do, audience, you can start thinking about your questions. If you're watching at home, start sending them in, because I want to get as many of your questions in as possible. So Chen-Ji, welcome. Thank you for joining from Beijing. Am I right in thinking that you were a part of the Chinese delegation in previous climate summits when it came to negotiating these agreements?
Yes, I was involved in the COP and UNFCCC negotiation for the past from 2010 to 2017. Amazing. So including Paris Agreement.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, great work. Thank you. So I guess I've got two questions for you. First, if you would like to comment on that previous question about Chinese public opinion, from where you sit in Beijing, what you think has been the changes in that? Are people more climate conscious now? And secondly, in the UK here, some in the governmental quarters have seen it as a snub that President Xi Jinping is not coming to COP26 as far as we know. What does China see as the expectations for COP26? Does it think that this is going to be a breakthrough moment? What are the expectations there?
Well, leaving the Chinese government for the past 4 years, I don't think I have the insights, but I can just share some of my observation. First of all, I think I would like to say that COP26 has already become a kind of buzzword, not only been discussed in the climate cycle, which I've been involved in for quite a number of years, but more broadly by many stakeholders. I think firstly benefit from the COP15 for the biodiversity that held in Kunming in China. So everyone knows what is going on in this kind of UN process. But I think more importantly, it is benefit from President Xi's carbon neutrality announcement last year. It's kind of like a pushing the carbon issue into the core of the main economy in China. And everyone now is talking about carbon neutrality, carbon peaking. When I say everyone, I'm not talking about those, traditional suspects like government think tank, research institute. I'm really talking NGOs. I'm really talking about someone like investors in stock market or company leaders. Right? Just to give you a very good example that I just experienced. A few weeks ago, I was invited to a blind call from a stock market investor and asking me how COP26 will push China to announce more policies that will be influencing China's stock market. So, from this example, you can see that it is, as I said, it is already embedded in the core of China's economy now, and everyone is really concerned about that. It's really a concern about the carbon issue, not only for the benefit of climate, but also for the benefit of their economic situation. And another kind of latest progress that I would like to add on is just yesterday, the Chinese authorities released a guiding document on the country's work to achieve carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals, laying out key specific targets and the measures for the coming decades. So, many believe that Chinese government will release, this is the kind of like a part of this, part of the 1+N policy framework. This is kind of like that one. The Chinese government will release a number of other specific sector-focused policy documents, and hopefully before COP26. I think that's going to be China's kind of demonstration or gesture to contributing COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, turning to audience questions. I feel like I'm some kind of examiner. Do we have any burning questions right now? Yep, please, gentlemen in the third row.
Hello, my name is Hilton Root. I'm a visitor at King's College. So I have two questions. One concerns an underlying issue, which is what are your thoughts about addressing the demand side? Because all of the approaches that you've suggested so far concern the supply, but from the Chinese point of view, much of the issue rests with the fact that they are the industrial engine of the world for products that they themselves don't consume. So long as the products are being consumed elsewhere, it would seem that some of the cost has to be reallocated to the consumer side. And I just wonder if you've thought about that. So the second question I have concerns China's diplomatic strategy with regard to how they will be negotiating. And so with the recent conversations between Secretary Kerry and his Chinese counterparts, the Chinese position has been largely, we're not going to discuss the environment carbon issue as a separate issue, divorced from other diplomatic questions. So in other words, their approach to dealing with this has been, you either take China as a package and all of the different components. We're not going to just chop it up, cut it up, and just deal with environment divorce, I say, from other issues that are of concern to governments around the world.
Two very good questions. Thank you. We'll just take one more question and then I'll throw all three back at you guys, our panelists.
Thanks. My question is really about trying to understand the barriers that China faces in climate change. So if you look at the IPCC report and global warming projections going forward, China is in the camp of sort of serious, severe in terms of the temperature rises. So it's much higher than it would be in Europe or the USA, right? So they're going to really suffer from climate change. So what do you think are the biggest barriers? Is it finance? Because obviously someone has to pay for the energy transition. And we've heard from the panelists that it's very expensive. Is it geopolitical? Is it more social? So I'm just trying to kind of put my finger on what is the biggest barrier. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. 3 very good questions. I'm glad I turned to the audience. So the questions are, when are international consumers who are demanding things from the Chinese economy going to start counting this sort of stuff within themselves? Or how does China deal with that international demand? Diplomacy, how does China segregate, or should it continue to do what it's currently doing, which is having climate change as a package with its other diplomatic issues? And finally, what's stopping China from moving faster, considering it's at such risk from climate change? Isabel, do you want to take one or two of those?
Okay, so the demand side first. So this is the embedded carbon question, which has also kind of bedeviled the attempt to reach a global solution for as long as there's been an attempt to reach a global solution. And actually, China's rather against the measures that might achieve this. They would be, for example, trade barriers and CBAM, the great European discussion, in which a consumer of an item in the United Kingdom would, through a tariff based on the carbon intensity of that item, as it were, pay more. So, but China doesn't want that, because it doesn't want trade and carbon intensity to be confused, if you like, or it would see this. He would see the invocation of carbon intensity trade barriers as an illegitimate trade measure. At least that's what they argue right now. Also, when you look at, as James laid out very clearly, when you look at where most of China's emissions come from, actually export isn't a huge part of it. And as we know, China is in the middle of many complicated transitions right now. And one important one is away from the old, low added value, export driven, investment driven model, which is exhausted, towards more circular economy, more dual circulation, more kind of domestic markets. So in any event, that transition is being attempted. But what has rather knocked it off course, it is partly the vested interest, to touch on the last question that was asked. There are enormous sectors which are committed to a high carbon emitting model, but also that a great deal of headline economic growth, of GDP growth, has been driven by those sectors. So we are watching the slow motion bankruptcy of Evergrande, the world's largest property development company. That matters for many reasons. One is that, steel and cement, as James laid out, is a massive part of China's emissions, particularly the way steel is produced, particularly the way buildings are built, and particularly the role that property development has played in the economics of local and provincial governments. So borrow and build has been a GDP driver. It's another exhausted model. You have huge amounts of huge quantities of surplus buildings in China, which, some of which are being blown up. But it has been an important part of the picture, and moving away from all of these embedded practices is difficult, because you get resistance from sectors, you get mismatches where you haven't actually managed to bring in a substitute, as with short-term energy crises. Unless you have an alternative, it's very difficult to reduce coal consumption. So there is a lot going on, and nobody said this was easy, but I think the kind of headline policy is moving in the right direction. But there's an awful lot of niggles and hiccups on the way. In terms of the package diplomacy, I'm not entirely convinced that is what Xi Jinping is saying to John Kerry. That's what Wang Yi, with the foreign minister who doesn't do climate negotiations, is saying. And well, good for him. And he may be trying to advance his own, separate agenda, but he's not doing climate negotiations. And I haven't seen that coming from anyone other than, a particular part of the foreign ministry. I think it's been rather, seized on by people who say you can't trust China, you can't deal with China. But I don't think that we'll hear it from Xi Jinping.
Chen-
And that's what counts.
Chenzi, I see you've virtually raised your hand. Would you like to come in on any of those questions?
Yeah, I just want to echo what has been just said. Actually, I would like to quote what Minister Wang Yi just said to response to Kerry. He said that the U.S. side wants the climate change cooperation to be the oasis of China-U.S. relations. However, if the oasis is all surrounded by deserts, then sooner or later the oasis will be desertified. So I think, and I can't agree more with Minister Wang Yi. I think it is an issue. It is kind of like a global issue. It is about at least partially about international collaboration and urgency of the issue. Giving the urgency of the issue, I think at least from the China side and U.S.-China side, they should collaborate with each other, not separating the climate issue with other.
James, let me come back to you on this. Based on that really beautiful quote actually from Wang Yi, do you think that what are the chances of Western cooperation with China on climate change, given the wider geopolitical context that we are in right now?
Yeah, I think whatever the facts on the ground are, and I agree with Isabel. I think she outlined it well. I think that you have seen that the meeting between the US and China. You saw John Kerry, go to meet with Xi Jinping, and you've seen that dialogue continuing. So I do think that this is an area where collaboration will continue. I don't foresee, because of the broader geopolitics, which I won't go into now, I don't foresee big announcements coming at the COP. I think that the way that Xi Jinping and the party has been playing their sort of climate diplomacy and some of their bigger announcements tends to be more around big set piece agendas. Obviously the UN General Assembly has become a sort of a big arena in terms of announcing big policy announcements. So the 2060 announcement was last year at the General Assembly. This year was the announcement around financing coal on the BRI, which is obviously important. And I think we'll probably, we had Xi Jinping in Davos in 2017, where he also made some, not necessarily the same policy announcements, but also similar sort of statements supporting the Paris Agreement and free trade. So I think that those kind of big set pieces will remain the forum where China makes those big announcements, and also because of the certain geopolitical tensions, there won't be big announcements at the COP is my personal prediction. But I think in terms of the collaboration on environment with China and the rest of the world, I think it's really key. And I think for two reasons. I think firstly that, one of the biggest challenges, and, one of the reasons everyone's here this week is making sure that China has, that China's rise and its relations with the West do remain on a good footing. This is, the biggest challenge over the next 20, 30 years. And it takes people on both sides, people in this room, to really be interested in that and understanding and collaborating to make this happen. And then I think that also China is so key on the environmental side and for getting to the goals that we need to on the climate side. And for that to happen, also you need this international collaboration. But then also that area is also, I feel, an area where it is ripe for collaboration between China and the rest of the world. So these two big challenges around the West's relations with China and the environment are, in my opinion, two of the biggest challenges that we face. And collaboration between the West and China is what's going to solve that. So I think it's completely vital, and I think and I also do see signs that it will continue, but I don't think COP will be the big moment where we see that coming to fruition.
Chenping, let me ask you the audience question about what's stopping China from moving faster in climate change, given that it's at a high risk of severe outcomes from climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that is a really good question. So I would like to comment briefly on the barriers. So we know that we need the technologies and innovations to help us get there. But the thing is, how can we make sure we have that meet that investment gap, and then to put the investment onto the necessary the technology and innovation that would be needed to get us there. So I think the main challenge is to have an overall development strategy and associated policies and institutions. That is very important part to drive the investment and innovation to facilitate the changes needed across the whole economy. We know that the world need to increase investment greatly to meet this gap, but with China, the investment level is already quite high. The thing is the composition of investment, how to guide investment to the key areas needed. And also, in the meanwhile, we also need to carefully address the major problem it may cause to ensure a just transition as well.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had a few virtual questions coming in, but I'll just take one more from the audience here. If anyone's got a question yet, that lady in the white jacket.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. I'm Cynthia. I'm here from Chatham House. My question, I guess I have two, actually. So the first one is, I was curious what mechanisms there are to prevent, Chinese companies from just offshoring some of their more high polluting industries, and whether in the carbon neutrality for 2060, they're planning to actually account for Chinese activities, investments abroad, both through the BRI, but even in other industries and other countries as well. The second is, I'm curious about whether you think China's climate commitment would withstand a leadership transition, and whether this commitment is more something that Xi Jinping strongly believes in, and not, after whoever comes next, 2060 is a long time. Is China still going to be on this road?
Brilliant. Thank you very much for those two questions. And I'll just combine three questions from the virtual audience into one, which is, what is the role of non-governmental organizations and non-governmental actors in the climate transition? So not just NGOs, but also private companies or non-governmental organizations like that, and multinational organizations that operate within China as well. So quite big questions there. Isabel, do you want to get started? So we're talking about
BRI and external investments, and there was a second part to your question. Forgive me. Carbon accounting. Carbon neutrality, would that include? And the political question. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
The political question and the role of non-governmental actors.
On the external investments, as we know, Xi Jinping's UN General Assembly announcement this year was about coal abroad, and China has been a major financer and builder of new coal-fired power stations externally. So in Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, lots of countries, Romania, and China had come and I mean, this is a big and welcome announcement. However, the fact is that host countries had been cancelling these projects because they increasingly look like stranded assets. And China was looking like it was out on a limb as the last country that was still building new coal in host countries. So that was a relatively painless announcement, which again was very welcome, but not huge. But additionally, there are moves in China around investment and the kind of climate due diligence of investment, which are at the moment voluntary. There's a traffic light system, for example, which was announced earlier this year, in which investments would be graded according to their, climate, their Paris compliance, or climate suitability. And I guess what a lot of people would like to see is those moves becoming more rigorous and more compulsory, and Chinese banks and finance institutions greening their investments far more rigorously than they currently do. It's also the case that host countries are increasingly aware that they don't want to build stranded assets. They don't want to get locked into high carbon pathways. And when the no new coal announcement was made, there was a second part to it, which was that China would assist countries to find a low carbon development pathway. Nobody challenges the right to develop. What people challenge now is that, we can't afford high carbon development as the default. And we don't need to, because China can now manufacture renewable technologies at a price which is cheaper than building new coal-fired power stations. You know, what matters is putting the package in place and getting the technical assistance to build and manage renewable grids and all of those things that a renewables pathway demands, which China is more than capable of doing if it would shift its focus to doing that instead of, you know, building instead of the old model. And we're beginning to see that, at least that declaration has happened, and that's important, as long as Xi Jinping is in power, which takes me to the other question. I think in any country, you know, you can see that it depends how that transition were to happen, frankly, which I don't want to speculate about too much, but in any country, you can see that a political crisis or a political transition can affect fundamental policy. However, it is also true that China's shift towards at least investment in low carbon technologies predates Xi Jinping. And I think it is going to be so embedded in China's industrial strategy that I would be surprised if that were to change. What might change in pace and intensity is China's own mitigation. But the industrial strategy of seeing circular economy, seeing low carbon technologies as the pathway to China's, you know, continuing industrial strength, being the supplier of low carbon goods and technologies to a carbon constrained world, all of that is now, you know, pretty embedded in China's future pathway. So it would be a major crisis for that to change. So let's hope it doesn't happen.
Chen-Xi, can I get your opinion on that power transition question in particular, and if you'd like to answer either of the others as well?
Right. I think everyone, all of us, talk about Xi Jinping, President Xi's announcement on no new kind of coal power projects. But I think this is the second half of the sentence in his statement. The first half is that to announce that China will significantly provide support to the green low carbon development for developing countries. I think that also demonstrates China's determination to support the solar, wind, those renewable energy, penetration in other developing countries. I think this is also kind of beneficial for China's interests. Because as the panelists also mentioned, that China has a huge manufacture kind of capacity in those areas, including solar, wind, EVs. So those products, I think will be very kind of attractive to shift it overseas. Yeah.
And James, can I get your opinion on the role of non-governmental actors in the energy transition? Could NGOs, multinational companies, or even domestic companies that are big energy users, could they lead the government in moving faster on this front?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, taking those in turn, I think on the sort of NGO space, I mean, coming from the perspective of what is considered in China an international NGO, and also with Chen-Xi as well, the great work they've been doing at Rocky Mountain, there is a role for some of the international NGOs to act as conduits and to help this collaboration with China, to help bring in expertise and bring out expertise as well, and keep that going. Things are a bit more constrained in that kind of world than they were maybe if you go back to sort of 2017 before the first NGO laws were put in place, but there's still very important and good opportunities to work, particularly to work more in a more collaborative model with Chinese academic institutions, NGOs, and others to really contribute to the debate and the conversation. The domestic NGOs, it's a growing active space, but again, there are constraints as well. In terms of multinationals, there's definitely been a big push for multinationals to put things in place. On the circular economy side, we've been working a lot on the topic of electronic waste. It's not a huge source of emissions, but globally, the electronic industry is around sort of 2% of emissions. So it does make a difference, and it's relatively hard to abate. And we've seen a lot of the international manufacturers that are based in China really pushing on the circular economy side to help get in place systems which can, for instance, where they can recycle all of their manufacturing scrap, which wasn't very easy before, or where they can collect back more of their product to recycle and, get back the aluminium or the plastics or this kind of thing. And, there's a collaboration there with some of the big Chinese brands as well to put in place systems to get a circular economy going. So there is an important role, and there's a role that the multinationals can play. As for Chinese companies, I think they definitely do play a very important role, obviously. So, for instance, on the finance side, we worked with Tsinghua University, Chinese Monetary Policy Committee, City of London on the green investment principles on the BRI or the GIP, and I'm working on that. There were a number of these financial institutions in China, also financial institutions internationally, who started by committing to a number of principles around green finance on the BRI. And this was a voluntary commitment. It started in around 2015. And I think the economics and the policies were probably another much more important factor. But that was also definitely a factor in giving the government confidence to then start phasing out coal investment and other dirtier investments on the BRI. So I think that there is a role that companies and some of these leaders can take to move forward. And as I mentioned before, state-owned enterprises and some of those big companies, they need to be on board and they need to drive this forward to be able to decarbonize some of those sectors like steel, like cement, like chemicals, like aluminium.
Could I just pick up on the multinationals, because multinationals who have big operations in China are now having to think very hard about how their energy sources in China might affect their own carbon pledges. So, the China part of their operations is becoming part of their central calculations, and they are beginning to look at that quite seriously. So again, you will see them having to adjust their operations or find different sources of energy. But also, as James said, there's a very big circle of non-government organizations, including expert opinion at universities, but also Chinese NGOs, who have over the last 15 years produced many ideas and policy suggestions which have subsequently been absorbed into government policy. So it has been a very dynamic sector, and it has been in advance of government thinking. I think it's all getting rather harder now, but it has been very important.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly add on that energy piece as well? And one example of that was that a lot of foreign companies which were looking to be 100% carbon neutral, they needed to be able to source renewable energy directly, which you can do, in the UK and the US, but you couldn't do in China. There's no system in place to have power purchase agreements with renewable energy. So over time, they've kind of collaborated with local governments, with State Grid, with other companies in China, and those systems are coming in place now. So now there is a developing system in place where companies can purchase renewable energy, for instance, and that's come from exactly that mechanism, which Isabel spoke about.
Great, and Chenping, would take your pick of any of those three questions.
Yeah, I fully agree with what had been said, and especially on the point that mentioned by Isabel that I think China has linked the low carbon transition with the country's sustainable development strategy and long-term prosperity. That is framed within the concept of ecological civilization, because China has realized that over past 40 years, the rapid development, that kind of economic model is not sustainable. So as President Xi Jinping mentioned repeatedly that China commitment to climate change, that is not at others' will, others' demand, but our own will, because we enter into this new stage of development, people's the demand from people for having a better life and for have better air quality and that kind of thing need a fundamental change in its development model. And also, I think the international cooperation is very important, as just mentioned by James, that, for example, if the UK, China, and US, if they significantly increase investment and policy support for like green industries, world demand will rise and then will push the development of new technology further. I think that is very important point from the demand side.
Well, brilliant. Thank you to all our panelists. We are 3 minutes to 10 o'clock, which leaves a good time for Hannah to tell you more about the rest of the events in this week's program. For now, please join me in thanking all our panelists. We've got Chunping Xie, Chen Ji, James Pennington, and Isabel Hilton.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for being a fantastic panel chair and moderator today. And thank you, Isabel and James and Chen and Chunping. It was a truly fascinating discussion and covered a lot of breadth and depth for such complex issues. So can you give a round of applause for our speakers today, please? Thank you to all our audience for coming along this morning in London, an early start, I know. And thank you to our online audience as well, and for getting so engaged with all those questions. That was fantastic. That concludes the opening panel session of China Week. But we have roughly 15 events throughout the week, so there's plenty more to get involved in. There's panel sessions, webinars, film screenings, a book launch, plenty of networking opportunities. So please do get involved. There's some programs around the room as well as online, so make sure to check it out. One of the topics, many topics came up today. One of the ones that I remember James mentioning was the challenge of decarbonising the steel sector. And we happen to have a webinar on that topic tomorrow morning. So if you'd like to check that out, jump online and register. Today, we are also very excited to welcome our first ever photography exhibition, which showcases the environmental issues across China in really stunning imagery. And that's just across the road at Bush House. So if you're around after this session, please head over and make sure to check it out. Thank you all so much. And it's fantastic to have you involved in our first ever China Week. Thank you.